And credit to the library. The library, despite there might have been logistical problems with hosting the history club, the library kind of let me run with it, and I thought it was a good thing. I thought it was a good thing to get involved in. And then the library closed in March, and so the history club, as we hoped that it might have been, didn't materialise in the way that we hoped that it might have. But since then, Richard came or well, he didn't come. He from the comfort of his home did a talk for the Linen Hall Library as part of our Northern Ireland Political Collection lecture series, and it was hugely popular. I mean, the interest in what Richard had to say there was phenomenal, and the views and the likes on his video, which is on our social media channels, continues to grow. And it was really from that moment that I knew that the LGBT History Club was something that the Linen Hall Library should be involved in, and these are the types of things that the library should be doing. So Richard has done most of the heavy lifting up to this point, and I commend him for it. My hope, I suppose, is that the Linen Hall Library will make some new friends as a result of this collaboration, and hopefully some new members at the end of the day. So I very much look forward to being part of this new venture in the weeks and months to come.
Thank you, Jason. You're too modest, because you neglected to say that you did uncover Sappho Woman, the Greater Belfast Dykes, in the basement of the Linen Hall Library. And when I knew that you could appreciate such a wonderful piece of lesbian animation and imagination, I said you'd be the person to approach for the partnership. And the other person that I was on my hit list was Dr. Tom Hulme, because I know Tom from School of History at Queen's, and Tom is a senior lecturer there, and he's maybe better known for publishing on urban culture in Britain and the USA in the early 20th century. And he has a recent book on citizenship and belonging in Manchester and Chicago. But he's also been working away in the archives on queer history, and he's got an exciting project in the offing on queer culture in Belfast from the late 19th century to the mid 20th century. I've already seen some of Tom's unpublished work, and I have no doubt that he's going to shake up queer history in Ireland. So you're very fortunate to get a preview of the type of work he's done, and I'm just so delighted that he is a kind of an inaugural speaker for the LGBT History Club. So I'm now going to pass you over to Tom. During Tom's talk, feel free to put in some comments in chat. I'll also keep an eye on some questions, particularly near the end of his talk. If you have some questions, you might find it easier to put them through on chat. Tom will speak for about 30-35 minutes. We're not under time pressure, so I'll very gladly pass you to Tom, and let's give him a virtual round of applause.
Thanks, Richard, and thanks for having me. I hope I don't shake things up too much. I wouldn't want to get you, well, in trouble with the library or anyone else. So I'm going to try and share my screen, or a portion of my screen at least, so then you can see some pictures as I'm talking. So can everyone now see that? Nod wildly if you can. Yeah? Okay. In that case, I shall begin. So I think when we think of historically queer cities, there are probably several places at different times in the past that come to mind. The late Victorian London of Oscar Wilde and his notorious description of feasting with panthers, perhaps. Or maybe Weimar, Berlin, and its underground club scene that was captured so vividly in the later life writings of the novelist Christopher Isherwood. But I think it would be fair to say that we rarely think of Belfast when we think of a historical queer city. But when we do think of Belfast, what perhaps do we remember? Well, I think it would be fair to say that this man often appears, the Reverend Ian Paisley, and his campaign, the notorious campaign at the time, to save Ulster from sodomy in the late 1970s. So unfortunately, oppression is an important part of queer history. To understand the fight for civil rights, you do have to look at the enemies of progress too. And I don't think I would be speaking out of turn as a recent blow in Northern Ireland to say that Ian Paisley is a bit of an enemy. But usually this means a story that starts in the late 1960s with the organisation of an internationally recognisable gay liberation movement, and then the many political campaigns that followed. But in this talk, I'm going to do something different. I'm going to put both the recent past and that fight for equality to one side. And instead, I want to take us back to a period in queer Irish history that I would say is much less well known, and that is the early 20th century, long before the birth of any homegrown gay and lesbian movement. So if we look at court cases and convictions, the kind of statistical measurement that is the go-to for most historians, we might assume that Belfast's queer scene, if we could call it that, was small or even non-existent. From the 1890s to the 1920s, the period I'm going to cover today, the Belfast courts tried less than 2 cases a year of what the law called gross indecency, a crime at the time that could lead to a prison sentence of up to 2 years. But even this statistic doesn't actually tell us that much. The law was severely lacking, given that it didn't treat consensual sex between adults any different from the clear sexual abuse of children. So when you actually dig deeper into the archives, you find out that many of these 2-a-year court cases actually related to what we would see now as clear occasions of abuse, whether that be within families or in settings like boarding houses. So roughly estimated, the case of consensual sex between men, adult men, that came before the courts was probably closer to just 1 a year. But I would say there are lots of reasons why the absence of prosecutions is not the same as an absence of sex between men. If we look over the water in Britain, there was a campaign in this period to clean up the capital. This meant that police were actively looking out for those that were flouting public norms of sexual behaviour. But in Belfast, there was no such fear, or at least not to the same extent. The Royal Irish Constabulary at the time pretty much simply had bigger fish to fry. For those of you that know your Irish history will know that this is the period in which the Home Rule crisis is beginning to deepen. And by the 1910s, militias were starting to form as well. When you add in the more basic facts that the police were understaffed, lacking money, it's no wonder that they weren't really putting much effort into trying to catch queer men. Most arrests at this time followed a chance discovery of 2 men in flagrante, rather than any great feats of police work or detectiving. And the ruling classes and the popular press were happy enough with this state of affairs. If you think about it at the time, a low arrest rate for homosexual crimes could be held up as an example of the very purity of Irish society. So if you're a Republican-leaning outlet at this time, like the Irish Morning News, for example, pointing out the sins of England over there in comparison to the virtues of Ulster over here, that's a useful tool of propaganda. So then, if we can't use prosecution rates, if we can't use what the elites are not saying, how do we actually understand queer culture in Belfast? Well, we have to look elsewhere. But fortunately for the historian, there are detailed statements that were made by the men who were arrested and also some of the witnesses to their so-called crimes. And if we put these statements together with snippets from the local newspaper, that rare mention of this unnameable sin, if we look for that suggestive nuance, read between the lines, we can build a tantalizing glimpse into a very different world, one I think that might actually surprise us today, a world far beyond the campaigns of the Reverend Ian Paisley. So Belfast was industrially booming and the undisputed regional capital of Ireland at the end of the 19th century, bigger than Dublin in this period. And the city was transforming in ways that created the conditions for men who were seeking men. In 1841, Belfast was home to about 70,000 people. Fast forward to 1911, and the city had swollen to almost 400,000. In the middle of town, old private residences were being torn down and replaced by much larger commercial buildings, department stores, hotels, restaurants. Increasingly, these were linked to the suburbs by a growing tramway system as well. And it was this modern urban environment that's really taking shape at the end of the 19th century that also shaped sexual experiences and identities. Think about street culture at the time, that jostling together of many bodies in one space and the ability to linger, to stare, to strike up a conversation. Bustling bars and restaurants at the heart of the city as well, and the social mixing that they encouraged, collapsed or at least blurred distinctions between the classes. So for men that desired other men, the city did have its dangers of discovery, violence, and public shame, but it could also be a land of homoerotic possibilities if you knew where to look, how to act, and what to ask. So, picture the scene. It's 11 p.m. on a Friday night in November 1894 on Great George's Street in Belfast's rowdy sailor town. Archibald Andrews, who was a 22-year-old and working as a fireman after several years at sea, is leaning against a lamppost outside his station. A man in his mid-60s, one James Douglas, approaches Andrews and strikes up a conversation about the pub across the road. When Douglas then began fumbling with the fireman's trousers, the younger man asked the older what he was doing, as you might expect he would. And he received a somewhat coy reply, "You ought to know." So Douglas had a lot of chutzpah, but other men in Belfast at this time could be even more brass. In 1892, the army chef, Frederick McGlinchey, who was up visiting from Dublin, went from asking for street directions to requesting, "Show me the size of yours." That he'd audaciously approached a policeman probably explains the swift slap on the ear that he then received. In the same year, another man, after having his advances on the street rebuffed, simply told his target that he could meet him on the street any night if he changed his mind before sauntering off away. Roger Casement, that famous Irish revolutionary, was never directly arrested for same-sex offences, but we do know from his sensational diaries that he also worked the streets of Belfast. In the early 1910s, he struck up conversations with potential partners near the Albert Clock and also on the Ormeau Road, both of which led to sex in more private locations. In the case of Casement, after money had changed hands, that is. And a few years later, by the time of the First World War, men were still meeting on the streets in much the same way. In 1916, teenage newsboys who were working outside Robinson's Bar, which is still there today, were not just selling papers. Edgar Milligan, who was a wealthy man who journeyed from the village of Lambeg to his office in Belfast, often picked these working class lads up before taking them to more secluded locations like hotels. We also know that public toilets were a place where men could linger and to some degree be in the nude. And this meant that they were absolutely ideal for serving as cruising grounds. The fireman that we met earlier, he maintained that he was immune to the approaches of other men, but he also described how he had spotted them wandering in and out of a busy urinal in Library Street. So members of the public were not blind to what was going on. As an example, in 1909, when one young man went into a city centre loo and saw two other men, as he described, not doing anything nor relieving nature, he decided to play detective. He waited around himself, and after those two men went into a cubicle, he fetched the police. And this was often how queer men were exposed, by members of the public choosing to essentially dob them in. As another example, in 1913, a middle-aged man who was working at the Great Northern Railway Station, the location of, shall we say, a very popular toilet at this time, saw a 70-year-old give a man in his 20s some money before they both went into a cubicle. This man then got his brother to spy on the two before they fetched the police together. And amazingly, it was only after two constables took turns going up a ladder to peer into the stall below, watching the men have sex, that the two were arrested. Men were sometimes found having sex in public parks too, like when a labourer working in the Ormeau Park in 1913 followed two what he called suspicious men and found them rolling around in the grass. So for many men, public places were a way of meeting another willing partner, whether they were sexually like-minded or simply open to a quick cash transaction. Whether there were any pubs or bars that harboured a queer subculture is somewhat harder to tell, and in the records I've looked at in the early 20th century, no establishment appears more than once. But if we read between the lines, it does seem that some were at least what we could call semi-queer, places where men could work away with the unspoken acceptance or at least ignorance of other patrons. In 1904, for example, an 18-year-old labourer met a man of a much higher class in a city centre oyster bar before they journeyed to a dark alleyway nearby. In 1916, another youth told the court how he was picked up by a rich man in the Bodega bar on Calendar Street before going back together to a hotel. But men that were having more than just one-off encounters could also socialise in bars together as well. During one early 1890s scandal, as the newspaper put it, a publican in the west of the city told the courts about how he had heard shameful conversations from the young men about their sexual exploits. He only saw fit to tell the police this after they'd begun to investigate this case anyway. And in 1917, two men of a similar social class, Vincent Cassidy and Hugh Sheehan, who we'll hear more about later, they conducted their relationship across popular theatres, restaurants and music halls without being caught or reported. So booming Belfast at this point is providing the opportunities for men to meet, to have sex, and arguably to even date like a straight couple might have done. Many of these men had experienced life in other major cities too, and I think it seems likely that they brought experiences of how to cruise home with them. So to go back to Roger Casement, for example, he was a perpetual traveller, a perk of his Foreign Office job, and also very well versed in the cruising grounds of London and other places too. But other much less famous men that were eventually arrested in Belfast, like Vincent Cassidy, had also spent time abroad. He'd lived in a London boarding house with a host of other young men, from Welsh to English to German, and he'd spent 2 years in New York too. When he returned to Ireland, he came via Liverpool, where he also told the other men he met there to come and find him in Belfast at the Grand Imperial Hotel, which, given that it was wartime, several soldiers did. In another case, in 1902, Thomas O'Connor, 30 years old, was fresh off the boat from America when he picked up an 18-year-old working-class lad called David MacDonald in the dock area of the city. After they'd had a few drinks with some local female prostitutes, O'Connor took MacDonald to a nearby brothel, much to the annoyance of the madam, who dobbed them into the police when it became clear there was going to be no payment coming to her. So moving between cities, picking up knowledge, understanding how to meet other men, these were the ways that people discovered more about themselves and also each other. But I think it's also worth saying that queer Belfast as a city depended on a very regional network that went far beyond the city boundaries as well. Many of the cases that I've looked at, these men were born in rural Ulster. They'd moved to the city to find work and eventually sex as well. But the countryside carried on to play an important role in their experiences, the court cases, and their afterlives as well. So Edgar Milligan, who we mentioned before, he may have travelled into the city to pick up young men for sex, but he also took them back to his country house in Lambeck for sleepovers. Casement, he travelled around Ulster as well with his Belfast boyfriend Miller Gordon. He went to Warren Point, for example, and Carlingford Lough, both in County Down. And Vincent Cassidy too, he took his dates to Bangor. Amazing as that might sound to us today, at that time it was a resort town and a well-to-do suburb of Belfast. But he also went to Armagh to meet his father, and Ardbow, a village in County Tyrone where his sister lived. So if relationships are beginning on the streets of the metropolis, they were carrying on outside the city too, and connections to the countryside didn't end there. For many of the men that were charged at this time, from unknown labourers to much more important businessmen, the bail money was provided by their family, who still lived on farms or in small villages. And I'd argue that the specific nature of Ulster also shaped other aspects of queer experience too. So when bail money was instead provided by friends and colleagues rather than family, they too were usually of the same religion. and this demonstrates the importance of ethno-religious community ties and support networks at this time. And when men were picking each other up in religiously segregated neighbourhoods, they were, of course, usually the same religion too. But if we think about the city centre, that area where those boundaries become blurred, anyone could be anyone, and the two communities were less obviously different. So these boundaries were sometimes then eroded in that pursuit of sex, men crossing the sectarian frontier. And to go beyond that to the moment of court, Ulster's political power structures also affected who got off and who didn't. So when Richard Lutton, who was a man in his mid-40s, was found in a city centre doorway having sex with a 19-year-old, he pleaded with the constable to be let go. When that didn't work, he tried to bribe him, promising a promotion and name-dropping how he was the private secretary of Sir Daniel Dixon. And amazingly, Lutton wasn't lying. He did work for Dixon, a major businessman, politician, and Belfast's first Lord Mayor, and Dixon's own son even provided the not insubstantial bond money to get Lutton out of jail. And then, in the ensuing trial at the Belfast courts, Lutton claimed, quite simply, that he'd been so drunk that he had no recollection of the event at all. A quite familiar excuse, we could probably say. But he probably managed to get off this charge because he could haul a whole host of elite Ulster Protestants before the judge to help him make his case. So Henry Hutton, the High Sheriff, he gave evidence of character. So too did Thomas Kirk, an important surgeon in the city. And even that former Lord Mayor himself, Daniel Dixon, appeared in court, insisting to the judge that Lutton was what he called a very manly fellow and one of his most trusted employees. And the judge ruled that the men were not responsible because they were both too drunk to be consenting parties. So now exonerated by the law, if I think we could say for a pretty tenuous reason, Lutton continued to work for the Dixon family. And when Daniel Dixon died, he left his former secretary a not insubstantial amount in his will, and Lutton carried on being active in unionist clubs in his local church as well. And I think we could argue that Edgar Milligan, that famous wealthy industrialist from Lambeg, he seemed to benefit from the same sort of privilege too. He was extensively investigated for seducing and paying young men in 1917. These young men, unknown to each other, had their stories corroborated in what seems to me to be a quite open and shut case. But when Milligan was arrested, he apparently even admitted his crimes, asking the police why the accuser's father had not come to him rather than them. And then, when that date in court arrived, Milligan used his connections amongst the Ulster elite to have James Chambers, who was no less than the Solicitor General for Ireland, defend him in court. And this was a decision that was signed off by a representative of the Lord Lieutenant General and Governor of Ireland, based in the Dublin Castle. So he's moving in pretty high circles here and using that power to help him get off this charge. We don't know what was said in court, but it seems that being the son of a prominent unionist and a philanthropist too was very important. He wasn't even named in the press, something that did happen to most people charged in this period. So clearly relationships between men were happening under the noses of the local population. But an interesting question to ask is, how much did people at the time actually know about homosexuality? If we look in the Irish newspapers, it was always referred to euphemistically, that most serious of crimes, that crime not to be named among Christians, or more simply, gross indecency. But away from that stiff upper lip of the court reporter, everyday inhabitants did have an understanding of men who had sex with men. So another famous figure associated with Belfast in this period, Edward de Cobain, who was a notable East Belfast politician, he was accused and eventually convicted of gross indecency in the 1890s. And his case caused a huge scandal across Ireland and Britain. Many people might have been shocked to find out that a member of Parliament was essentially trying it on with young male office workers. But witness statements from the court case revealed that he'd been known as Old Buggery Cobain for some time. And learning about Cobain even gave other people in Belfast a language to describe what they essentially already knew existed. So that fireman, we go back to again, Archibald Andrews, when he was telling the police about his unwanted encounter with James Douglas, he said, firstly, that he had heard the sailors talking about this sort of thing when he'd been at sea. But he also claimed that Douglas had wanted to Cobain him, and he went on to explain that he read in the papers about this outrageous case the previous year. Oscar Wilde, of course, we can't have a paper about Queer Ireland without Oscar Wilde. He was also a go-to reference for these otherwise unspeakable sins. So an example from 1907, 2 men were discovered busy hugging and kissing one another, as the report put it, in a stable in Lisburn, which is just outside Belfast. When a constable was located to arrest these 2 men, the witness described how the accused had been doing Oscar Wilde. I should point out, doing meaning something quite different than it does today. But what about the men who actually chose to have sex with others? Well, I would argue that in many cases there was a clear power dynamic at work. Much younger and poorer men, or teenage boys as well, were usually being paid for sex, sometimes as little as 6pence. When caught, this younger or usually poorer partner was usually treated more leniently by the courts, especially if they made it clear that they were sorry for what they had done, or blamed the demon drink, or managed to get someone in a position of authority like a teacher or an employer to talk about how good they were usually. Some of these younger men as well, even when they'd been caught taking the active sexual role, described how their older partners were making a woman of them. So this suggests that they saw themselves as fulfilling a subservient role rather than necessarily identifying themselves as different. But one thing that most men did know at this point was what it meant to be arrested and to appear in court, what that meant for their life at the time and the life that might follow. So to give an example, when William Seaton and James McGee were found by 2 constables at 1 a.m. in October 1898 in an alleyway, they begged, for God's sake, please don't expose us and disgrace us. A couple of years later, after being arrested, another young man told the police that all he wanted was to keep it out of the papers so that his friends would not know what he had done. Unfortunately for these men, these pleas usually fell on deaf ears. The newspapers may have used euphemistic language, but the average reader, I think, would still have understood when they saw the name of someone they knew next to an offence of gross indecency. But at the same time, I think we should be careful of accepting that all men were ashamed or secretive when it came to how they treated their relationships with other men. That whole process of being caught and hauled before the courts really encouraged people to perform this sense of regret as a sort of mechanism to elicit sympathy and possibly to get off the charge as well. As we've seen from a few examples, the way that these men actually acted when they were on the streets doesn't really suggest that they accepted the verdicts of hellfire and brimstone judges or the prurient press. Finding these voices in witness statements can be tricky, but we do have a good example of how people didn't necessarily see themselves as being abominations. So Hugh Sheehan, that young medical student we met before, he was a witness in a 1917 case, but never charged with a crime. It seems to me that the police were happy enough to just use him to get to the older and richer ringleader, Vincent Cassidy, who we have a picture of here. So for this reason, Sheehan, I think, felt freer to kind of share all and explain to the police in some detail what his sexual behaviour was and why he'd done it. So he described to the police the various things the 2 men had done together and how he was actually quite free to go home any time he wanted, despite the fact he was living in this hotel with this other man. He even told the court that he didn't make the statement to save his own skin, which seems to me to be an unnecessary admission that is more suggestive of defiance than guilt. And Sheehan even boasted about his worldly experience. He said even before he met Cassidy, he had knocked a little bit about town and partook in midnight suppers. He said that he knew what a young blood was and believed he fell under that category. He made it clear, even more interestingly, that he had been with music hall girls, as he put it, but not with pantomime girls, so drawing a line between the two. For Sheehan, it seems that the difference between respectable and unrespectable women was greater than the difference between men and women. So he didn't really see his behaviour as unnatural or dishonourable, but simply a part of a much larger sexual appetite. How many other men in Belfast felt like this when they were away from the prying eyes of the court? I think we can unfortunately only speculate. It's also worth saying that for many of these men that were caught up in court cases, Yes, they might have been worried about shame and the fallout afterwards, but it very rarely spelt the total end of their lives. Hugh Sheehan didn't go back to his medical studies at Queen's, but he carried on working in his father's shop in West Belfast. He married and then emigrated to the USA in the 1920s. And many other young men took this same course. They married, they had children, they slotted back into society. Of course, we can recognise that some of these men may have been shamed into closeting themselves, but others, I think, might have just simply moved past the youthful same-sex dalliance. For some of the older unmarried men, though, their bachelor lifestyle, as it was described, did continue. But in many cases, they remained active parts of the local communities. They were members of churches, political associations, and social clubs, and rather than be pariahs, they were generally accepted. So I hope this 30-minute jaunt, a quick one, has shown what life might have been like for queer men in Belfast in the past. Like in other cities at the time, it was street culture that provided opportunities for coded displays that led to sexual encounters for those in the know, whether that be in public places or behind closed doors. Pubs and hotels could also be ambiguous enough that men could pick up each other and continue relationships out to a large degree in the open. And like in other cities as well, there were different power dynamics, motives, and self-understandings that made up the kaleidoscope of what same-sex relations could be at this time. You might have working class lads who were otherwise heterosexual, supplementing their meagre incomes by satiating the desires of older, much wealthier men. But you could also have one-off trysts between those of the same and even different classes, and in fact, longer-term relationships as well, that to me seem to be as much about friendship and fun as they were simple sexual satisfaction. That's not to say that the risk you might find yourself in court was a real one, as was the danger of assault if you accidentally approached an unwilling participant. But only a small amount of men were arrested, especially if we compare it to those dark days of the 1950s and 1960s in Northern Ireland, when the amount increased at least fourfold. And at the time, many were either found not guilty or even charged at all. Yes, some men expressed shame or remorse, especially if they'd been caught by the police, but others were honest and even accepted their desires. So to have this same-sex moment didn't mean that people saw themselves as being somehow abnormal. We've said how difficult it is to try and find these people in Belfast, but how unique was it? Well, it wasn't, of course, London or New York or Berlin in the scale or visibility of its subculture. But when the city was booming in the late 19th century, I think it was similar enough to those cities that the behaviour and the identities of the men looked quite similar too. But there were some subtle differences. Men moved across multiple Irish worlds, from rural homes and communities to ports and global cities abroad. And I think they took and brought back ideas of understandings of desire. If these men were arrested, it was those same Irish networks that provided bail money, helping those men return to a semblance of their former life or aiding their move to a new one. And if a moment in court arrived, those same common ideas of guilt and respectability that you might have got in England, they did make a difference, but so too did a man's position in the Ulster elite, or more commonly, lack of position as well. Clearly then there is a lot more to be said about Belfast in this period, and it's worth saying, as I'm sure you've noticed, women have been conspicuous by their absence in what I've said. This isn't for want of trying, but I'm yet to find any sources from this period that can be used to tell their story in Belfast. Their love or desire wasn't really criminalised in the same way, and that perennial problem of finding women's stories is multiplied tenfold when you think about the difficulties of using sources that talk about women more broadly. But that is a story I think that remains for another day, and hopefully other people to take on that task as well. But I'll leave it here for now.
Great, thank you very much, Tom. And I think we'll give you a virtual round of applause. In fact, I can even unmute people so that you might even be able to hear it. No. Okay. Tom, that was brilliant. There's so much material there that you'll be glad to know that I managed to record Tom's talk. But I didn't manage to record my own preamble. So in the future, when there are people saying, what happened that first night of the LGBT History Club, it'll be on your own recollections as what happened until midway through Jason's introduction. So there is loads of new material there, I expect, for many of you. So you may wish to go back and look at the recording when, in due course, I put it up on our social media. There are some questions that have come in on the chat, and also comments. You know, very interesting, Tom. People find very informative and engaging what you said. The question has been raised about women, and I think you've already made reference to the fact that the particular material you're drawing on, and someone also mentioned about what other subcultures, and I should point out that, you know, this would be a series of talks, and our next talk is about lesbians, and we hope to have a speaker on trans history later in the year. The question was asked by Chris Hamill, and I'll put this to you, Tom. Did you just look at court records from Belfast, or are there records of this nature in other county courts?
So for this talk, I only used the records that I've looked at for Belfast, but the records for both County Down and County Antrim, which is the jurisdiction that Belfast would obviously fall into, both of those survive, and there are other cases from outside Belfast as well. I mean, because of the very nature of sexuality at the time and of cruising cultures, most of the people you would have found would have been in Belfast. But I think that there are these cases in other parts of the 6 counties that became Northern Ireland as well. Unfortunately, some of those haven't been catalogued yet by the archives, but I've been assured that they do exist. So, and I know from looking at the newspapers that there were cases in Derry for certain, and I think in other places as well. But pretty much I would say anywhere with you know, a reasonable population, say 10,000 people, in the period I've looked at, there is a mention of some sort of case associated with it. So yes, it's certainly not just happening in Belfast, but that is really the kind of the key location for it.
Thank you, Tom. There's a question that builds on that. It's from Brian Gilmer, who says, did you use newspaper searches? Which you said you have, but what particular keywords did you search for? Okay,
so yes, I've lost days of my life searching newspapers. So there's a whole host of things, from the quite obscure to the much less obscure, and it can be difficult because sometimes the terminology used will also describe other things. So to give you an example, you know, these newspapers don't want to say homosexuality. They never say that. They never say buggery even, which would have been a really clear, you know, example of what was happening. They might say a serious offence or a most serious offence. So I've been through probably every single occasion of the mention of a most serious offence in the newspapers. But you then have to kind of calibrate that with the court records as well. And it might turn out that, you know, 9 times out of 10, a most serious offence is a heterosexual crime like rape, for example. But that 1 in 10 might also be, you know, a kind of example of 2 consensual adults as well. There is, you know, some language that's used, which is usually a sign that this is a queer case they're talking about. So if they say unspeakable sin, that is often referring to this, unless it's referring to abortion. So you have those kind of difficulties of language, but gross indecency might be one term that's used. The crime not to be named among Christians is another. But I'm sure there are more as well. You know, these are usually the terms that are used when they're reporting court cases, so they kind of shielding the people that they're reporting about or the audience they're reporting to. But I wonder if there are other examples in the press when they're talking about a wider problem, but I've yet to come across those. And I'm certainly be interested to know if there are terms that I should be using to try and find more.
That's great, Tom, and I'm sure it'll be useful to other historians who have a look at the newspaper archives. There's a question here from Kim Walsh. Are there any records of more committed partnerships?
That's a great question. I've not come across any yet. So it's worth bearing in mind that a lot of what I'm talking about is a kind of a public cruising culture. And this means by its very nature, it was often transient. You know, these were people looking for sex who might then have gone back to their wives, or indeed they may have just gone back to living on their own in a kind of closeted kind of way. But it is the case that people are looking for more committed relationships, I think. So one of the things I didn't mention in this talk, but there are people that are using the newspapers at the time to also try and meet people of the same kind of sexuality. So they might put an advert in the newspaper saying they're looking for a chum who is musical, you know, these kind of code words that you might have got. So certainly those people are out there. Other adverts in the press as well, saying that they're looking for a roommate who's also a chum, who's also musical. Hopefully, some of those cases ended with people falling in love and living together forever. But unfortunately, I can't confirm any of that at the moment.
Thanks, Tom. Dwayne Farrell says, great stuff, Tom. Really interesting and brilliant to see this element of our history being documented and brought to life. Thanks. And I think that highlights how some people don't believe that we have a queer history. I know I've encountered this. You know, people think it all just began maybe in the 1960s, 1970s. And so it's really new material that you're bringing to light here and highlighting that same-sex sexuality and relationships have been around for a longer time than people often think. The question here from Shane Cassidy, is there any evidence of homophobic abuse around that time?
So yes, unfortunately there is. In some of these cases where the man had approached a man that wasn't willing, you know, they often, well, not often, but on occasion, they would try and deceive the man. They would pretend and play along. And then when they got them somewhere more private, they would beat them up. Unfortunately, that did happen. You know, there would be examples of robbery in cruising grounds as well, which I think we could probably expect is related to homophobia in some way as well. So yes, that certainly did happen. It's conspicuous by its absence a lot of the time, though. You know, it seems to me that people often went to the police before they went to violence. But I guess, you know, in a sense, we could say that going to the police was a form of homophobia in itself anyway.
I'm trying to get through lots of questions here, Tom, and you're doing very well to answer them. From Flores, do queer people or their opponents, meaning prosecutors, politicians, in this age, compare Belfast as a queer city to other cities, either contemporary?
That's a good question, and they do, but only to stress how much more moral Belfast is usually. So it's, you know, look at London over there, you know, full of sin, but look at, you know, good Celtic Ireland, avoiding those sorts of temptations. And interestingly, they sometimes compare themselves to Scotland for the same reason. So they say, you know, Ireland and Scotland don't have this problem, but England does. So there is that sense of comparing. I've not seen any comparisons to ancient cities yet. That doesn't seem to be a language that is used in the sorts of records I'm looking at. But I mean, it's certainly the case that in middle class queer culture, not just in London, but more broadly, people did often turn, especially those that had a classical education, would turn to those sorts of metaphors from the past as well.
Anthony McKee is dying to know, is there any certain areas or streets that come up repeatedly that could be taken as queer areas, the same way as Union Street now?
It's also a good question, and it's the case that there isn't a sort of designated queer zone or gay zone in this period, but what you would often have is that slightly rougher areas where you might also find female prostitution would also be an area where you might find men. So this was, and you get the same thing with pubs as well. It's usually the less reputable pubs that turn up in the records. So anywhere where anything might go, and especially if it might be somewhere where you get sailors, is often a place that might be more amenable. So Great George's Street, for example, does come up, you know, in the sailor town, and there are other cases around there as well. And like I said, it's often that they're close to brothels. So that it's this kind of overlapping of heterosexual prostitution and queer culture. Those two things come together. But there certainly isn't a sort of district like Union Street today.
This is like Mastermind. And tonight, Tom Hulme, your question is queer Belfast in the early 20th century. Next question is Nick McGlynn, do any of the men refer to themselves in particular terms like queer?
the very short answer to that is no. Essentially, I've not come across anything like that. No self-definition at all. The only time that people in these kind of court records ruminate on their identity or sexuality is to say that, you know, they know what they've done perhaps and that they're sorry for it. So there is this sense of, you know, it is an act rather than an identity. And then the opposite end of that scale, you know, this example of Hugh Sheehan, who says, you know, that he's just kind of a bit wild sexually and he's open to anyone, which I guess we could see as an identity as well. But no, that there isn't really the same discussion. But it comes down to the sources again. You know, it would seem surprising to me that the people that are putting adverts in the newspaper, for example, they must have had a conception of themselves as being different. You know, these aren't furtive encounters; they're hiding in plain sight in a way. And clearly, some of those men, the way that they acted on the streets when they're trying to meet other people, it doesn't suggest that they necessarily, you know, didn't have a sense of being and a sense of what they wanted. But it is difficult to say with the lack of, you know, importance that's actually given to the voices of these people at the time.
Still questions coming in. One from Michael Lawrence, a young historian, just graduated from Queen's. He says, on the topic of class dynamics, did you come across any evidence of upper class men being blackmailed with exposure by lower class sexual partners?
Yeah, so there are examples of this, from the amusing to the really upsetting. So there's one case where a younger man sort of tries to up the ante and say, you know, if you want to have sex, you're going to have to give me more money than that, and if you don't, I'll go and tell the police. So that does happen, that kind of casual blackmail. There's a much more disturbing case from a later period, so the 1930s, where a man in Derry, you know, makes out as if he's interested in this other man, and then when the other man responds, he then blackmails him for a long, long time, for months. And the man who's been blackmailed, who's essentially, you know, living in rented rooms behind a bank, so he's not necessarily upper class, but he was certainly closer than the man who was blackmailing him. He did eventually commit suicide. So, you know, there are examples of that happening. Interestingly, when that case did happen, the newspapers were very, very sympathetic to the man that had been blackmailed. You know, blackmail as a behaviour was seen to be the lowest of the low in this point, lower even perhaps than a man who was sexually attracted to other men.
There's a comment here from number 2337335, who points out that
sorry, that's my payroll number for some reason. Instead of my name, it's Monica.
Monica, thank you. You're probably not meant to share your payroll number, so we'll pretend we
who cares? You'll hack away. There's nothing much interesting there.
You made a good point how the suffrage period will also inform the lesbian timeline from 1890 1920s. And if you're interested in that period of lesbian history, there's been some very interesting work done by the historian Dr. Mary McAuliffe at University College Dublin, and she's published on some of the women involved in the Irish nationalist movement who are in same-sex relationships. There's a question here from Joshua on, given the political unrest at the time, was there much evidence of homosexuality accusations being used to attack political opponents?
So yes, definitely. Edward de Cobain, who we mentioned, that East Belfast MP, he argued that this was all a conspiracy against him to try and oust him from office. So he, you know, whether he was guilty or not, it's difficult to know, but he certainly thought that this case brought against him was an example of that. And also Roger Casement, the Irish revolutionary, he, like I said, was never arrested for same-sex crimes, but when he was finally arrested for his revolutionary behaviour, the police found his diaries, which were full of, you know, really graphic details about sex. So that was then used. The British government circulated those diaries to supporters of Casement to try and dissuade them from supporting him anymore. So yes, there was the kind of the political use of homosexuality as well.
If you're interested in Roger Casement, there's been obviously substantial work by Jeff Dudgeon, and some of you will know of Jeff as the man who brought the case to the European Court of Human Rights to secure a partial decriminalisation in 1982. But I mean, Jeff has published the volume of the Black Diaries on casement, and we hope to have Jeff as a speaker sometime later in the series. Question here from Martin, who's wondering, are you going to bring your research beyond the period that you presented here into the pre-Troubles period?
Yes, it's the short answer to that, definitely. So I've already started looking at the 20s and 30s, and working with a colleague at Ulster University, Leanne McCormick, we're trying to get money from the government to do a really big project that looks at not just Belfast, but the whole of the 6 counties that became Northern Ireland. I know that doesn't slip off the tongue, but we're trying to look at the period both before and after partition. So that's the phrase we're using at the moment.
Yeah, and there's a question on that from Phelim Brennan, who says, is there a difference in queer culture between the whole of the island and partition?
That's a great question. So there is a great PhD on the topic of queer culture in Dublin, I think from around about 1916 to the 1970s or 80s, by Avril Earls. So there is work that is being done on Ireland, and there are some suggestive differences between Belfast and Dublin, but there are also similarities as well. I do think it's the case that the context of Ulster means that there is kind of specific aspects about it, even before partition. You know, these men in Ulster that are part of a political elite are travelling around Britain a lot. You know, they're part of that world as well as being part of Ulster. And I think, like I said, that does, you know, go into how they're treated by the courts. But I think, you know, it'd be important to do more work to see just how different is Belfast from the rest of Ireland. And I know there is work being done on that, which is exciting.
Tom, you've done very well because I've gone through all the questions put on chat. Now I'm going to remember that I need to take a screen pick, and I mean there are about 3 different screens because of your big crowd, so I don't know who's going to appear, but obviously if you don't want to appear you can take off your video, but it's just a general shot to show that we had I suppose this event, and I'm just taking my camera. I'm not very good at multitasking, as you can see, so I don't even know who I get in this, but that's great. Tom made reference there to new historical work that's been done, particularly by younger historians, and some of that I will and have posted on the social media of the Heritage Project, which is at LGBT History NI. The project itself is meant to focus on the period of the 80s and 90s, but I think the History Club gives an opportunity to look, you know, across a much broader period. And Tom, you've worked very hard, and you, the audience as well, have been very attentive. I have a few things before we wind up. One is if there's anyone who wasn't able to put a question through chat, but if they wave wildly, I might actually see you on the multiple screens, and then you could unmute yourself and you could ask your question. So if there's anyone who wants that format, you could just wave and speak up if there's a question that you'd like to ask orally, rather than so you'd have to unmute yourself and speak out if there's a question that you need, because we've had lots of questions by chat. Right, Tom has just put up here his email address. If you want to contact Tom, you can get him on t.hulme, Hulme, @qb.ac.uk. That's in the chat. And that reminds me that I should also put into the chat a thing called Survey Monkey, which is a sort of a 2-minute feedback, because my funders, the like to know how we are getting on. So I'm just looking now for putting into everyone, and I am going to paste this into the chat facility, and then if you either click on the link or copy it and take it out, and then click on the Survey Monkey. There's about a 3-minute survey that can tell you how you experienced this event, which is called the LGBT History Club with Tom Hulme. That would be very helpful to me. Now, the announcement I'd like to make is that if you enjoyed this evening and you'd like to come back for more, I'm delighted to say that we have our second LGBT History Club talk on the Tuesday of the 25th of August. So that's a month's time, Tuesday. It'll be at the same time, 8 p.m. On Zoom, and you've all been able to contact me to get that link. I actually intend using the same link, and I'm delighted that our speaker will be one of our own Heritage Project volunteers, and we're very fortunate to have Dr. Amy Finlay, who's going to give a talk called Mary Dorsey, Lesbian Poet Activist. Some of you will know of Mary Dorsey as a poet, but maybe not so familiar with other aspects of her life. And Dr. Amy Finlay is very well placed to give us a lot of new information about what for most of you would be an unknown area of our queer history. And that is means I am probably ready to remember to switch off the record, which I, of course, did not remember to turn on time, but I'm going to do that now. But before I do, I'm going to say thank you to our funders, the Heritage Fund. Thanks to Linhall Library for collaborating with the launch of the LGBT History Club. And thanks especially to Tom Hulme, who gave us a fascinating talk about a period that most people would know very little about, and who you know, is just opening up a whole new area of history generally, and particularly for us, queer history. So let's show appreciation by giving Tom a big round of applause. Thanks, Tom. That was great. So if you have time, go into the chat, click on that Survey Monkey, and that'll to give some feedback. I may end up emailing some of you anyhow to get some feedback on through the Survey Monkey if you're not able to do it here and now tonight. But thank you very much. I know there's COVID and we had social isolation lockdown, but it didn't stop us from celebrating Pride. So happy Pride. Enjoy the rest of the oh, that's a great rainbow flag, Tom. Oh, Claude is fantastic. I love it. Mary, Monica, there's actually a lot more. The Middletons, there's a lot more rainbow stuff there. So we may have been taken off the streets, but we haven't been silenced. So keep it up, and look forward to meeting some of you again soon. Thank you very much for your attention. All the best. Good night. Happy Pride! That's it. It's quite strange doing it in sort of mute, isn't it? Oh yeah, stop the recording. Stop the recording if I can find that now.